The anime opens by depicting the monotonous life of a Japanese salaryman who endured being shoved around on a packed commuter train every morning and barely managed to catch the last train home each night. That dull routine defined his existence until the moment he was reincarnated into another world and appointed as the lord of a remote village he was meant to develop using his abilities. However, one day, he awakens and immediately notices how small his hands have become. Realizing that he is now inhabiting the body of a child, he rushes toward a nearby window and looks outside, only to see an expansive kingdom he does not recognize at all. His confusion is abruptly interrupted when his personal maid panics and hurriedly pulls him away from the window, warning him of the danger. He apologizes for worrying her and explains that the scenery was simply so magnificent that it overwhelmed him. The maid is startled by his vocabulary and wonders where a child so young could have learned such complex expressions. This revelation deeply confuses him, and he realizes that while he possesses vague memories of having lived here before, this situation closely resembles the reincarnation stories he once knew. He correctly identifies the maid as Till, his personal attendant, and when she confirms it, he also realizes that his name is Van Ferdio, often called Van. Till is delighted that he can properly say his family name. To her further surprise, he correctly recalls his father's name, Jalpa, the Marquess of the Fercio house, as well as the names of his three older brothers, Mercia, Jard, and Sesto. However, despite knowing all of this, he remains unaware of his current location. Later that morning, the family gathers for breakfast. Van sees his father, Maris Jalpabul Atio, and his brothers, Mercia Eligo Fercio, the eldest, Jar Giercio, the second son, and Sesto Eleo, the third. During the meal, Van is showered with affection by the maids, who constantly praise and spoil him. Although he privately finds the situation amusing, he accepts it without complaint. From this, he concludes that he has been reborn into this world while retaining all memories from his life in Japan. That is the only certainty he has for now. During breakfast, Maris Ferdio asks his sons about their studies for the day. Jard nervously reports that he will be studying fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto explains that he will focus on magic studies. When Van is asked the same question, he calmly states that there is much he does not yet understand and that he wishes to begin by learning about the nation's culture and history. This sophisticated answer from a 2-year-old shocks everyone present. His father, however, smiles before laughing loudly, clearly pleased. He remarks that he had worried about spoiling Van due to being the youngest child born to his late wife, Mira, but now believes Van to be a fine young lad. Confident that Van will inherit powerful fire magic like both his parents, Maris declares that the future of House Ferdio is secure and eagerly anticipates Van's magical aptitude appraisal at age 8. Through this conversation, Van learns that magical aptitude holds great importance in this world. Individuals with offensive magical abilities are highly valued for their role in protecting society. Noble families strongly desire heirs with aptitude for one of the 4 elemental magics: fire, water, wind, or earth. Those who possess other types of magic are considered disgraceful. Knowing that his father and brothers all possess elemental magic, Van understands the immense expectations placed upon him. Determined to better understand the world, he begins asking Till countless questions. She explains that ships can only safely sail from the kingdom's main port due to massive sea monsters inhabiting the deep ocean. She also tells him about the many races that exist, including elves and dwarves, before being stopped by other maids who worry the information is too complex for him. Van reassures Till that he genuinely wants to learn more. When he asks about magical tools, she eagerly explains the existence of magic crystals, gemstones, and ores capable of storing magic. These materials can be used to create tools aligned with one's magical aptitude. Their discussion is interrupted when the butler, Espada, suddenly places a large stack of books in front of Van. Though aware that Van is officially learning basic literacy and numeracy, Espada wishes to assess his true abilities. Van finds the veteran butler intimidating and nervously admits that his reading is poor and that he can only perform simple arithmetic. Espada immediately tests him by holding up 3 fingers on one hand and 2 on the other. When Van answers correctly, Espada decides on the spot to become his tutor. Unable to refuse, Van is subjected to grueling daily lessons. As a result, he learns to read and write within weeks and spends the next 2 years studying relentlessly from dawn until dusk. By the age of 4, Van begins sword training and often spars with Till, who easily dodges his attacks and teases him. During one such session, other maids intervene, accusing Till of disrespecting a noble. When they demand punishment, Van is confused, as he feels no offense. The head maid explains that such behavior would normally be considered a crime. Instead of issuing a harsh punishment, Van simply flicks Till's forehead and declares the matter resolved, leaving everyone stunned. Van continues studying swordsmanship daily, and by age 5, he can fight evenly with older trainee soldiers. His prior life experience gives him an edge, and soon he gains a reputation as a prodigy. Despite his noble status, he treats children of lower rank kindly and ensures their safety after each duel. During a break, Van meets Dee, the deputy commander of the chivalric order. Dee notices the lack of calluses on Van's hands and realizes that his academic training is far more intense than his physical one. Shocked to learn that he has been studying 3 times harder than others, Van begins to understand how abnormal his upbringing has been. Dee insists on personally training him in swordsmanship, promising to go easy due to his age. This promise proves false, as Van is forced through brutal exercises daily. Though exhausted, Van finds joy in this new life, experiencing a sense of fulfillment he never felt before. By age 6, however, the constant pressure becomes overwhelming. Wanting to enjoy his childhood, Van deliberately decides to slack off. He visits the marketplace for the first time, where he witnesses a man attempting to sell his own child into slavery. Horrified, Van intervenes and purchases the boy, Kamsin, granting him safety. Due to noble restrictions, Kamsin must officially become Van's slave to enter the mansion. Though uneasy, Van agrees for Kamsin's protection. The contract is sealed, and Kamsin begins working at the mansion, eventually growing healthier and more confident. As Van approaches his 8th birthday, anticipation spreads across the kingdom for his magical appraisal. Expectations are shattered when it is revealed that Van possesses no elemental magic and instead has production magic, widely regarded as useless. Enraged, his father nearly kills him before Mercia intervenes, proposing that Van be sent to govern a remote, undeveloped village instead. The proposal is accepted, and Van is exiled under the guise of becoming a lord. Though the situation is grim, Van looks forward to a peaceful, laid-back life. Despite his father's intention to send him away quietly, his departure becomes public due to Dee's actions. As Van leaves the capital, the people gather to give him a heartfelt farewell. Surprised and touched, Van waves back, sincerely thanking them all as he begins the next chapter of his life. The journey toward the new city stretched on longer than expected, the road winding through forests and plains still unfamiliar to Van and his companions. Along the way, Van demonstrated his remarkable affinity for production magic. With a simple gesture and focused intent, he shaped raw materials into usable tools, repairing damaged equipment and creating necessities with ease. His companions watched in awe, whispering among themselves about the rare talent they were witnessing. Yet, despite their admiration, Van himself felt conflicted. While his magic was powerful, he privately lamented its lack of obvious combat applications. In a world where strength often meant survival, production magic felt strangely misplaced in his hands. However, before they could proceed, the carriage came to an abrupt halt. The sudden stop sent a ripple of tension through the group. Looking ahead, they quickly realized the cause. Smoke rose in the distance, and the village gates were surrounded. The settlement was under siege. Van immediately gathered his companions to assess the situation. Dee, ever composed, surveyed the scene and concluded that bandits were responsible. Van observed the formation carefully. Archers surrounded the village from all sides, loosing arrows toward the gate. Yet something was off, the arrows seemed strangely ineffective. The villagers huddled behind the gates, frozen with fear, unable to respond. Van quickly estimated the enemy's numbers. Around 50 attackers, far more than their own party. Dee proposed a direct assault, confident that cooperation would secure victory. One of the hired adventurers objected, arguing that charging an enemy force of that size was reckless. Dee acknowledged the danger but countered that he had fought on the front lines many times. He did not deny that there would be casualties, but insisted there was still a viable way to fight. The adventurer reminded him that their contract only covered escort duty. Risking their lives to defend a village was beyond their obligation. Dee responded firmly, stating that this village was the first territory of his lord, the first place to shelter the people under his rule. If they would not draw their swords now, then when would they? Though the adventurer respected Dee's sense of honor, he insisted that such ideals did not apply to mercenaries. Understanding the mercenaries' stance, Dee nonetheless pleaded that they at least protect Van. Espada immediately objected. He argued that if Dee were to fall, the territory would have no future, even if the village was reclaimed. Then, to everyone's shock, Espada revealed his true capabilities. Despite his advanced age, he was a mage capable of wielding all 4 elements. He proposed a strategy. He would raise a barrier to shield the adventurers while they attacked from afar. Once the enemy focused their attention on the barrier, Dee and his men would strike from the flanks in a coordinated assault. The plan promised a high chance of success. When Van asked if Espada intended to fight, The butler answered calmly that he must. Otherwise, he would serve only as bait, leading to the deaths of Dee and the others. Van refused to accept the possibility of losing his butler. He also urged Dee not to take unnecessary risks. Dee was not just a warrior, but the group's strategist. Losing him would cripple the territory before it could even take shape. Van then offered himself as bait. His mate immediately rejected the idea. Kamsin volunteered as well, but Van refused. He explained that he could not bear to watch someone he loved die. He insisted that Kamsin must live a long life as a free man. Overriding further objections, Van resolved to advance mounted on the carriage, drawing the enemy's attention from the front while the others launched attacks from the sides. He reassured them that his daily swordsmanship training with the vice commander of the knights would keep him alive. Privately, however, Van accepted another possibility. If he died protecting his people, it would be an honorable end for a lord. He silently hoped that if he fell, his body would be discarded and his identity hidden, sparing his family any trouble. The adventurers watched this exchange in silence. Among themselves, they admitted they had never encountered a truly benevolent noble, only arrogant ones. Van was different. One of them, previously reluctant, decided he wished to remain in the territory of Marquis Furcio for a long time. Van suddenly appeared before him, thanking him for accepting the job. Caught off guard, the adventurer admitted that exceptions among the nobility might exist. He decided to fight on the front lines, entrusting his life to Van. When Van hesitated, the man explained that he could not refuse a child willing to risk his own life. His companions agreed, noting that while they often mocked nobles, they had never met one who remembered all their names. Because of this, they chose to trust him. Dee and Espada committed as well. Protecting Van here meant protecting the future of the Marquis family. Still, Espada scolded Van, reminding him that as a lord, he needed to understand the weight of being an heir. The strategy was revised. Espada would maintain the barrier and handle long-range attacks. Dee would take the left flank. The adventurers would take the right. The battle began. The barrier rose, shimmering with layered magic. One adventurer marveled at the mage's power, while another remarked that had he refused, he would have willingly taken Espada's place. He even expressed a desire to see Van become king someday. The invaders fell quickly. Attacked from behind and unable to coordinate, panic spread. Dee's overwhelming presence caused many to flee outright. During the chaos, an enemy attempted to ambush the support group, nearly striking one of the women. Van reacted instantly, cutting the attacker's legs out from under him and finishing the fight with chilling calm. He warned the group to stay alert. By the end, all enemies were subdued and captured. Not a single casualty was suffered on Van's side. After receiving their reward, the adventurers discussed their future. Though the territory promised little immediate wealth, several decided to stay. One had a fixed job elsewhere, but the woman Van saved chose to remain. Others followed. They wanted to see what kind of person Van would become. Van was later scolded harshly by his maid, who demanded that if he ever risked his life again, he should use her as bait instead and never act so recklessly again. Entering the village, Van introduced himself as the new lord. The settlement was in terrible condition. The elderly village chief thanked them deeply and explained that the village had been attacked repeatedly that year. Since Count Ferdinand's time, night patrols had ceased. Van realized that under his father's rule, the village had nearly been abandoned. Van expressed regret, understanding that low taxes made the village a low priority. He declared that complaining was useless and instead proposed solutions. He outlined 3 measures: creating value so the kingdom could not ignore the village, ensuring steady income to hire mercenaries, and independently reforming and developing the settlement. When hope wavered, Espada revealed his status and Van's talent. Expectations soared. Van reduced taxes from 30% to 10%, earning cheers. Reconstruction began immediately. With earth magic and cooperation, the walls were reinforced. Van promised prosperity through unity. Testing his production magic, Van created an object so durable that even a sword could not damage it. That night, when asked about his limits, he admitted he could not sense any. The next day, he decided to build a house. Visualizing the structure, he activated his magic. In moments, a large house stood where none had before. And with it, the foundation of a future was laid. Although the structure is far more suitable for land management than typical elemental magic, making his skill truly intriguing, Van maintains that offensive magic remains superior for protecting people. He reasons that subjects would feel more secure under a lord who masters combat magic. However, Kamsin disagrees, asserting that he would rather live under Van's rule than Lord Jelpaz. He argues that while strength matters in war, people ultimately seek a ruler who improves their daily lives, a need that no one meets better than Van. Astounded that Van built an entire house alone, surpassing the capabilities of ordinary production magic, the villagers become excited. Van agrees to build houses for everyone provided they supply the timber. The village chief also requests new homes, noting that their current ones are collapsing due to harsh weather. Though Van initially finds the prospect of doing all the work at once exhausting, the sight of their miserable living conditions motivates him to radically renovate the village. Van constructs a whole new neighborhood in moments, replacing the old, dilapidated shacks. He explains his method involves pre-planning to avoid inequality. He makes all the houses identical for the time being, promising to customize them with stone once resources become available. Overwhelmed with gratitude, the villagers watch as Van also constructs a simple public bath next to his manor. Plural uses water magic to fill the tub, while Kamsin heats it with charcoal, creating a traditional Goemon-style bath. While Till and Plural enjoy the hot water, they praise Van's brilliance, recalling that even at age 2, his knowledge rivaled that of adults and he was a prodigy who consistently defeated soldier boys in swordsmanship. Meanwhile, Van and Kamsin bathe after a tiring day. Kamsin expresses his desire to become as strong as Dee to protect Van, just as Dee and his men join them in the bath. The next morning, thanks to the combined efforts of the knights and villagers, a great trench is completed around the village. To bolster defenses and secure a water source for drinking and bathing, they decide to turn it into a moat. Espada and his men begin diverting water from a nearby river, digging a trench dozens of meters long while Dee and Kamsin work manually. Van follows behind to reinforce the bottom and sides of the canal, despite the massive scale of the project. A shared goal makes the labor feel light, as they believe that improving conditions will attract merchants and lead to a peaceful future. Although Van estimates the work will take a week, the team works with such vigor that they finish much sooner. By the end of the day, everyone is exhausted except for Dee, who wishes to continue working as a form of training. The following morning, the connection to the river is finalized. Van thanks his men for their hard work over the past day and a half. As they open the gate and water flows into the moat, the village celebrates. Thinking ahead, Van worries about potential flooding during heavy rain and suggests creating a lake behind the village. Espada agrees, noting it could serve as a reservoir during droughts, and they decide to proceed with the plan. Talia marvels at the transformation, noting how the village went from lacking a waterway to having a reservoir lake. An old man expresses his gratitude to Van, relieved that they no longer have to trek to the river just to get water. Van reflects internally that he is glad water is now accessible to everyone, knowing life will become much easier for the entire village. Elsewhere, Panamera and Arte are shown playing and laughing together in their carriage. Panamera advises Arte to get some sleep, noting that the journey to the remote village is still long. The next morning, back at the village, Van is busy with further preparations. Talia observes that their defensive wall is now complete and much sturdier. Van reflects on his technique, noting that he experimented with mixing stones into the earthen wall to make it as strong as concrete. A young boy remarks that bandits won't be able to attack them anymore because of such a formidable barrier. Wanting to ensure even greater safety, Van crafts simple catapults and adds shields to the front so the villagers can fire arrows while remaining protected. Though the village is small, it begins to resemble a fortified city. Dee comments that it is no longer just a village, but a small fortress that bandits could never invade. He laments that if Lord Jelpa's new Van possessed this power, he would have made him the head of the family or a development consultant, as Van's clan is strong enough for combat, perhaps stronger than anyone else. Espada interrupts, chiding Dee for placing too much value on a leader's fighting ability alone, arguing that Van's power is best suited for protection rather than invasion. Van steps in to stop the bickering, stating that resenting their circumstances or talents won't help, and that they must make do with what they have. Later, Van enjoys a meal, deeply impressed by the food. Espada mentions that while protecting the village is vital, they must address its internal economy. He notes they have no connections except for traders who might visit once a month. Van suggests he can provide houses and furniture, and that the village crops are sufficient for food. However, Espada points out they lack spices and the ingredients for the baked sweets Van loves. Frustrated, Van urges the group to brainstorm something the village can sell. Kamsin suggests selling the wooden blocks Van creates or hunting monsters for resources, but Van rejects these ideas. Espada notes that finding something unique to sell from this village will be a challenge. The discussion shifts to weaponry when a young boy, who cherishes a wooden weapon Van made, is mentioned. When Van previously asked the men to test their weapons, they refused, not wanting to damage gifts from him. Van explained that while he was happy they cherished the items, they would not be able to protect themselves if they didn't learn to use them. He discussed a shield made from orcs that was sturdy yet flexible. To demonstrate, Camison struck it lightly, not wanting to break it, but the wooden sword shattered the shield anyway. The boy burst into tears, and everyone was shocked that a wooden weapon could cut with such sharpness. Suddenly, Ortho appears with minerals to sell. He explains that the deep forest at the foot of the Wolfsbrook Mountains is swarming with powerful monsters, which is why they find so many rare minerals without even entering the mountains. He presents iron ore, copper, silver, and even a bit of gold before revealing mithril ore. Ortho explains that mithril is usually only discovered during official surveys by the Knights of Honor due to its rarity. Van realizes that if these are found at the base, the mountains must be full of resources. Van takes the iron ore to use immediately. He experiments with it, noting that since he didn't melt it for purification, he isn't sure of its purity. He decides to make an iron shield for the boy and crafts a sword as well, telling his young customer that he paid extra attention to the decorations. Van uses his magic to craft a longsword, leaving everyone speechless. The adventurers immediately ask him to make swords for them as well. Van asks if his work is truly so well made that even professionals want one, and agrees to craft weapons for the adventurers for free since they provided the raw materials. Plural remarks that while they need to test the weapons to be sure, he believes Van could sell them for a very high price. Plural notes that he hasn't heard much about extracting minerals from forests instead of mountains unless there is a Adamas, a dungeon or monolith site nearby. Ortho asks if they think there is a Adamas here, to which Zara replies that no one knows for sure since the area hasn't been properly surveyed. Espada explains that discovering a Adamas would radically change their situation, as people and goods would flow into the village from everywhere. Van realizes the weight of this possibility. A new Adamas would cause the village's importance to skyrocket. Espada adds that these sites are national treasures filled with precious gems and resources, and typically, once the guild hears of a new one, they open a branch in the nearest town. However, Espada warns that while adventurers and merchants would come, the village currently lacks the food, infrastructure, and facilities to support them. Ortho suggests they should avoid looking for the Adamas for now. Plural questions if the Knights of Honor would be sent immediately if news got out, and suggests that Van must develop the village and achieve significant results before the discovery is public. This would make it harder for the Versio family to intervene, as they would otherwise profit more by reporting the discovery themselves. Later, while walking through the village with his maid, Van observes that they are doing well in terms of housing and declares that the temporary renovations are concluded. Suddenly, armored lizards are spotted approaching from the main road. Van immediately takes command, ordering the drawbridge raised and the gates closed. Addressing the frightened villagers, he acknowledges their fear of fighting an injury but emphasizes that everyone's life depends on this battle. He declares that while he will fight for them, he cannot protect everyone with his strength alone, asking them to lend him their strength so they can protect the village together. Motivated by Van's calm but resolute pep talk, the villagers swore to fight to their last breath to protect their home. Fear still lingered in their hearts, but it was now anchored by determination. Van immediately instructed everyone to move to the wall and take positions behind the ballistae, knowing that hesitation would only invite destruction. Compson soon informed Van that Ortho and his party were still out hunting. With the village's strongest fighters absent, a dangerous gap in leadership had formed. Van decided that he would go up to the wall with the villagers to personally oversee the defense. Before he could leave, however, Till grabbed his arm tightly. Tears streamed down her face as she begged him not to put himself in danger. Van hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, but the situation was too urgent to delay. After a brief pause, he changed his plan. Instead of going himself, he ordered Dee to head up to the wall and relay everything he saw in real time. Van would remain on the ground, issuing commands and coordinating the defense. Dee accepted the order without hesitation and rushed toward the wall. The moment Dee reached the top, he froze. The sight before him was overwhelming. He quickly reported to Van that approximately 40 armored lizards were advancing toward the village. Each monster stood nearly 8 meters tall, massive enough to tower over houses and trees. Their heavy footsteps shook the ground, and their thick scales glimmered ominously. Panic crept into Dee's chest. He knew that even veteran knights would struggle to defeat a single armored lizard. Facing dozens of them with only a handful of trained fighters seemed impossible. Van's voice came through clearly. He ordered Dee to load the iron arrows into the giant crossbows. The knights immediately protested, insisting that ordinary weapons would never pierce scales tougher than steel. Dee silenced them. He was fully aware of the risk, but Van had proven himself time and time again. Trusting his instincts, Dee ordered everyone to load the ballistae and fire. The arrows vanished upon impact. For a brief moment, Dee thought the attack had failed. Then he realized the truth. The bolts hadn't bounced off, they had punched straight through. Wherever the iron arrows struck, massive holes tore through the lizards' bodies. Seconds later, the monsters collapsed, their enormous inertia carrying them forward before they finally hit the ground. In the first volley alone, 10 armored lizards were slain. Dee stared in awe. Not only were Van's weapons far more powerful than expected, but the villagers' aim was remarkably precise. He rallied them for a second round. The knights warned him that they had only one iron arrow left per ballista. Dee ordered them to fire anyway. More lizards fell, but when the dust settled, half the pack remained. Worse, they were completely out of iron ammunition. Dee relayed the grim news to Van. As the remaining lizards continued their advance, Van desperately searched for a solution. Then he remembered something crucial. Kamson's wooden sword had once cut through Fatty's high-spec shield. If that was possible, then perhaps. Van ordered Dee to switch to wooden arrows. The knights reacted with disbelief, calling the idea absurd. Wood could never penetrate hide tougher than steel. Dee shut them down immediately. Van had shattered their assumptions repeatedly, and Dee chose to trust him once more. He ordered the villagers to load the wooden arrows and fire. To everyone's shock, the wooden arrows pierced the lizards. Though the shafts embedded only halfway into the thick scales, they penetrated deeply enough to strike vital organs. One by one, the monsters collapsed instantly. Laughing in disbelief, Dee ordered another volley and declared that they would be feasting on lizard meat that night. Arrows rained down until the final armored lizard fell. Dee proudly announced their victory to Van. Cheers erupted across the village. Till hugged Van tightly, while Van stood stunned, struggling to comprehend that his wooden weapons had defeated monsters of such power. On the wall, the knights marveled that no one had been injured and that they still had plenty of ammunition left. Dee felt a slight disappointment the battle had ended too quickly, proving just how overwhelming Van's abilities were. Soon after, Ortho's party returned and began directing the processing of the lizard corpses. Eyes, fangs, skin, and magic cores were set aside for sale, while the meat was preserved. Ortho noted that armored lizards were usually difficult to process, often causing the meat to rot. Thanks to Van's knives, the work proceeded effortlessly. That night, the village held a massive celebration. Ortho's group praised Van's weapons, prompting Dee and the knights to demand swords of their own. Van refused payment but promised to craft them later. Later, Ortho explained that while armored lizards sold for 20 gold coins, spoilage would reduce profits. Even so, the earnings were massive. Espada then revealed the harsh truth. Half would be taken as tax by the Marquis. Devastated, Van agreed to report the victory to Mercia, crediting his elder brother instead. The next day, 2 merchants arrived, shocked by the fortress-like wall. Van greeted them atop the gate. Recognizing the Marquis's genius son, they introduced themselves as Bell and Rango of the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Once allowed inside the village, the merchant brothers were escorted to the warehouse. The moment they stepped inside, they froze in shock. Piled high were scales, claws, hides, and bones from armored lizards, quantities that seemed impossible for a small, nameless village to harvest. While the brothers struggled to process the sight, Van calmly asked if they were interested in buying the stock. The merchants agreed immediately, but requested a month to arrange a proper team and transportation. Van accepted without hesitation. He even offered them the lizard meat for free, explaining that without refrigeration, it would simply rot. Next, he displayed the weapons he had produced. The craftsmanship left the brothers speechless. The quality far exceeded their expectations, and they accepted Van's asking price without attempting to bargain. When Van asked them to help promote the weapons, the brothers hesitated, clearly hoping to monopolize the trade. Van noted that others would eventually discover the village anyway and proposed a different plan, establishing a permanent shop directly within the village. The brothers instantly saw the profit potential and agreed. Before they could fully process the agreement, Van used his magic to construct their dream shop right before their eyes, cementing a partnership. Shortly after, the village received 2 unexpected visitors, a noble girl and a formidable female knight. Around the same time, Espada gave Van new homework, instructing him to plan a city for 10,000 people, predicting the village would grow at an unprecedented pace. When asked for his vision, Van rejected standard square layouts. Instead, he proposed a star-shaped fortress designed to force attackers to waste time navigating multiple defensive choke points. Espada praised the tactical advantage of the design. Soon, a red-haired knight announced the visitors' arrival as emissaries from Ferdinando County. The knight introduced herself as Panamera, a viscountess who had risen by merit, while the nervous noble girl was Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando. Panamera bluntly asked if Van understood their purpose. She explained that the Count feared Marquis Jalpa was using his genius son to prepare for an invasion. However, Panamera admitted she had a different theory, She suspected Van had been exiled for lacking elemental magic. Van confirmed this openly. He explained he had been kicked out with nothing but his luggage. Dee and Espada added that they had remained behind solely out of loyalty and admiration for Van's character. To settle the matter, Van decided to demonstrate his abilities. Outside, Espada raised a temporary earthen wall. Van then used production magic to process the mud into solid concrete and formed a sturdy wooden gate. Panamera and Artie were stunned. Van explained that production magic, considered the weakest form, was the reason for his exile. This revelation struck a chord with Artie, who seemed to recognize her own situation in his story. Panamera then moved to her second objective, formally offering Artie's hand in marriage. Van understood this as a political move to prevent conflict and declined, stating he desired only peace. Panamera admitted she had initially opposed the idea but had come to respect Van's character, jokingly adding she would marry him herself if she could. When asked directly, Artie shyly admitted she hadn't considered marriage yet. Van encouraged her to take her time. Realizing they needed a place to stay, Van promptly built an inn using his magic. During dinner, Van bonded with Arte over her love for cute things. Later, Panamera left them alone, and Arte quietly told Van he was a nice person before retreating to her room. Back at his mansion, Espada shared a realization. Since Arte was sent to a nameless village to marry, she likely lacked elemental magic as well. Understanding that Arte might be an exile just like him, Van resolved to let her stay in the village if she wished, regardless of whether marriage ever became part of their future.